Hi, everybody. The bad news is that Keith Monroe is not going to be able to present Skype it in or the virtual or thing that he sent us. It's not loading properly, so we're really sorry. Keith, we wish you were here. I would like to introduce France Trépanier to be our panel chair, and here we go.
Thank you, Julie. Sego, France Trépanier, Young Cats. My name is France. I'm an artist and curator of Ghanaian Gihaga and French ancestry. I'm very pleased to be here on these traditional territories. Thank you, Julie, for having me. It's a beautiful event. I want to say how happy I am also to be with my colleagues from New Zealand and Australia as part of this program. It's great to have you with us. Today, for this panel, we're going to talk about games and graphics as resurgence and presence. Julie didn't mention, but one of the panelists was not able to join us, so Keith Monroe won't be with us today, but we have 4 beautiful panelists. And the first one, so I'm just going to do a quick intro, and then we'll let you present. Dr. Rilla Khaled is Associate Professor at the Department of Design and Computation Arts at Concordia University in Canada. This is Montreal. Her research and practice has centered on the design and learning and persuasive games, interactions between games and culture, and practices involved in emerging forms of game design. Our next panelist, Monsieur Sébastien Aubin, is currently working as the Indigenous designer in residence at the School of Art at the University of Manitoba. Through his program, he is producing a body of creative work and research that extends our understanding of design and graphic form. He has worked for some of the most prestigious graphic design studios in Canada and maintains a career as freelancing graphic artist. You might have seen some of his beautiful books and publications. May I, because we don't have bios for both of you, is it possible to ask you to introduce yourself briefly?
Yeah, for sure.
Thank you.
My name's Justin Larrivee. I am a co-founder of Red Rising Magazine, along with Kevin. And there's a number of other collective members and co-founders. I'm a graphic designer, and I've worked for Farmery Estate Brewery and the National Association of Indigenous Workers, and I've done freelance for a number of years. And right now I'm in school in urban and inner city studies, and I also work for the Wrench right now, so build bikes and teach youth how to build them. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Tansani Burju, Okima, Megazine, Indigenous Makundadam, Fisherver and Dunji, Winnipeg and Dunji, Matheson and Dunji, West End and Dunji, Home Street and Dunji. My English name is Kevin Settee, and I'm born and raised in Winnipeg. My family's from Fisherver and Matheson Island on my dad's side, and on my mom's side, they're from Little Saskatchewan and Fairford. And along with Justin, I helped co-found Red Rising Magazine. There's about 15 of us in the collective, and we all contribute equally in terms of the amount of time and effort we put into it. I see myself as more of an organizer and an event planner, and like to do kind of work behind the scenes, and also being mentored, by Justin and other graphic designers and photographers in the collective to start doing that kind of work with Red Rising. So yeah.
Thank you. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Rilla Khaled to present. Thank you.
All right, hi, I'm Rilla Khaled. I'm the director of the Technoculture Art and Games Research Center, which is part of the Milieu Institute for Arts, Culture and Technology at Concordia University. And I'm also a co-investigator on the SSHRC-funded Initiative for Indigenous Futures Partnership Project. So today I'm going to be talking about representations of diversity. Games have a diversity problem. This comes as a surprise to no one. This is the case whether we're thinking of diversity as gender, age, or as my work has frequently circled around, representations of non-Western ways of life. And the imbalance in representation becomes especially jarring when we look at who's playing games but still being left out of them. So in 2009, my colleague Mia Consalvo, together with others, conducted a large-scale study examining game characters and their characteristics in light of the US population at the time. And they found that female characters only accounted for about 15% of game characters, while the demographics of players showed that 40% were female. When women did appear, they were more likely to be in secondary roles rather than primary ones. White characters made up 85% of all primary characters, which is overrepresented compared to the census data showing that 75% of the population identified as white. Hispanics, despite making up 13% of the population, only made up 3% of characters. Native Americans were 1% of the population, but accounted only for less than 0.1% of characters. And as with Hispanic characters, only featured in secondary roles. So one path towards a solution might be to just diversify the skin of characters. With digital games, you're dealing with digital assets. So it's technically fairly straightforward to swap in alternative assets. And this is known as a reskin. For instance, in Minecraft, it's fairly easy to change the skin of characters. You have your Star Wars skin, or if you prefer, a Flappy Bird skin. In a crafting type game like Minecraft, the player's abilities to craft and customize extends to the skin. But the thing with a reskin is that it doesn't change the underlying behavior. Applying the Flappy Bird skin to Minecraft doesn't mean that Minecraft now acts like Flappy Bird. Then there's the practice of reskinning entire games. That is, putting a new graphical layer over a game structure or mechanics, resulting in a new game. So this is how we can move from Flappy Bird on the left to Flappy Potato on the right. But note that just as with Minecraft-style reskinning, the underlying behavior of the games largely remains the same. So reskinning is a start. It's a visual means for game worlds to expand the meanings that they potentially communicate, or the people that they speak to and invoke. The Cat and the Coup is a puzzle game set against a narrative backdrop of the fall of Mohammad Mossadegh, the first democratically elected leader of Iran. The game relies on the visual aesthetic of Persian miniatures to represent a here and now that is likely to be unfamiliar territory for many players and conveys part of a complex and contentious history. The puzzles themselves don't stray that far from familiar formula, though. Move an object here, make a timed jump there. Another example is Never Alone, which I believe is being shown during this exhibition. And this takes the concepts and play we associate with platformers for exploring Inupiat stories. Never Alone presents two player-controlled characters, a small girl and an Arctic fox, out on a quest to find the source of a blizzard. They run and jump their way along ice floes and benevolent spirits, helping each other to avoid blizzard winds and other malicious entities. The game design and narrative were informed by numerous community members and elders and the game segments are spliced with cultural insight videos about Inupiat life. So to be fair, we are starting to see more frequent visual representations of diverse characters and cultures in games. But for all this talk of visual representation, how we make meaning in games isn't just tied to how game objects look. It's heavily tied to how they act and behave. So at this point, I need to invoke some theory on culture with an ulterior motive of convincing you why it's an important lens with which we should be interpreting games. Early play scholars noted that there's a link between culture and games, suggesting that play and games are shaped by surrounding culture, and equally that culture is transmitted via play and games. Games and culture share structural connections too, and I don't want to fall down the rabbit hole of defining either games or culture, but I will point out that cross-cultural research describes human culture in terms of some of the same structures that we use to understand games. So it can be viewed as a system. It has sets of rules that are understood and observed by its members. Those rules embody a perspective on desirable interactions with others and the environment. And from these rules and how we're rewarded, we can work out what actions are valued by those around us. Confused about whether I'm talking about culture or games? It's because I'm talking about both. Systems, rules, desirable actions, these exist in both. So one way to read culture is to think about it as a game about how to be successful in life, in a way that makes use of a particular rule set. So notably, the rules in Bangladesh, where I'm from ethnically, aren't the same as rules in New Zealand, where I grew up, aren't the same as Danish rules, where I lived for 3 years. Different cultures run on different cultural rule sets. And some culture theorists, such as Gerrit Hofstede, go as far as likening culture to the software of the mind, like a software or digital game version of life imitating art. And this is thinking in the direction of culture as games. But we can do the thought experiment in the other direction as well. So games as cultures. What are we allowed to do in game worlds? What are we rewarded for doing? What are the underlying systems and rule sets that have been hard-coded into the game? Existing digital game worlds didn't happen by accident. Someone, somewhere, programmed or coded those rules into software, bringing them to life. A game like Lim relies heavily on coded behaviors to convey the experiences of transgendered people in a world made for cisgendered people. The visual style is very minimal, and the instructions are minimal too. Z to blend, arrow keys to move. What you soon work out is that your objective is to pass through the world attracting minimal attention, which requires changing your form wherever you are. Blue squares greet you with a lot of violence, and when you take on a blue form, you have to move slower. You can't retain your blue or brown state. It keeps shifting. And your square can get locked into positions in which you can't move it out of, or it can get entirely knocked outside of the walls. Lim conveys a nuanced view on what it's like to be transgender, and it does this without traditional visual representations. And maybe it's precisely because Lim strips away traditional visual representation that it's easier to focus on the message being communicated by its rules and system. Lim strongly invites a code-level reading. And actually, due to the role of interactivity and rules in games, all games invite a code-level reading. So then the question becomes, does game code stand up in terms of representing deep diversity? And this is where the issue with reskinning surfaces again. Recall that reskinning means different skin, but same code. We're not really representing diversity if everyone shares the same code. Someone, somewhere, chose to code game world and character behaviors in particular ways, perhaps because they seemed appropriately expressive or entertaining, or were deemed familiar enough for players to grasp, or were convenient to implement, or perhaps because alternatives simply didn't occur to them. So I want to pick up an example I mentioned earlier, Never Alone. So Never Alone features helper spirits which bend into forms that need to be used as platforms for the player to progress. So spirits are essentially platforms. On the one hand, this incorporates the important Inupiat cultural concept of helper spirits into the traditional language of a platformer. But on the other hand, these helper spirits exist in the game in an instrumental way. They become reified into platforms, into things that we use to help ourselves. This is elements of real-world culture being bent to fit tropes of game culture. So there's two sorts of cultural pulls going on here, battling it out with respect to the code, Inupiat culture and game culture. And in the specific case of spirits as platforms and Never Alone, game culture wins. I can understand too why designers made this choice, as this game already introduced a lot that was new. And this game has already done so much important work concerning culture and representation. But the reason why we're all here is to talk about the future and what we can do moving forward. So what should we do when cultures that we want to represent through games are in tension with existing design tropes? We should make new designs. The game Inside is also a platformer, but a very different one from Never Alone. It's set in a post-apocalyptic future in which a certain class of people have had all individual agency stripped away and can be puppeted about via mind control devices. And while this is initially presented as horrific, as the game proceeds, the puppeted bodies become familiar. They become allies in a world in which everyone else is hostile. And eventually the player character becomes enmeshed in a giant body made up of scores of puppeted bodies. And this is when you as a player realize that you've become those bodies. Those bodies have become you. Because your movement moves all of those bodies. And only once you've merged with those bodies are you able to escape the facilities that you've been trapped in. At the code level, this is a meditation on the futility of moving about the world alone and how it is our communities that save us. Inside makes a small but important tweak to how we think about bodies and platformers and games more generally. I and they must literally and materially become we. So instead of starting from existing game genres and tropes and relying on that which currently exists to supply the vocabulary for what we want to say, we should first focus on the cultural and behavioral metaphors that are important to us. Perhaps we can find existing mechanics and tropes that convey the worlds we imagine, and we can reuse existing code. But that code might simply not exist, and we need to write new code. All digital game tropes were new code at some point. Just because it's new doesn't mean it can't become part of the game coding repertoire. Code is so important because it is the main determinant for how digital worlds work. We need new code, and we need everyone's code. So let's go forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khaled. Monsieur Aubin? Oui.
Hello, everyone. I'm Sébastien, ou Sébastien Aubin. Some people call me Seb, but anyway, it doesn't matter. I'm going to do more of an informal presentation because I find it very interesting how we can talk about the future at the same time talk about the past. And what I'll do is I'll take the component of me as a graphic designer, but also as an artist. I was born in Manitoba. I lived in Outaouais all my life, and now I'm in Winnipeg, and for 6 months doing a residency. And the challenges were to decolonize and indigenize the school, the University of Manitoba. How do you do that? And try to put everybody in the same melting pot, like Innu, Crees, Ojibways, Sotos, all these people, and the Métis, right? And this is where I'm going to start it a little bit on the kind of like the quantum physics, because this is what I've been studying a little bit. There's two things that I found that are very important within our culture is that we always have a tendency of seeing the black and the white, seeing the good and the bad. And those two formulas are kind of something that has to distinguish us as a community compared to maybe, let's say, the colonizers, sorry for lack of a better word. But what I find interesting is that from the get-go, even on a graphic basis, on a super simple basic visuals, we looked at the wampum belts. Let's start there. And what I like about that personally is that it does take, well, I know one of them is more purple than black, but it also represents like the empty and let's say the clarity. So one needs the other to actually exist. And what I find about that is that it actually talks about binary codes. And for me, the black and the white, just those forms, those shapes, are actually so simple, but so futuristic in a way. And this is where I've been establishing myself in this decolonizing and indigenizing the school, is where do we situate ourselves actually to pass on the information? A lot of people say that the wampum belts are, you know, for like to do legislations and stuff like that. Sorry, lack of a better word, I'm more of a French speaker, so if you ever get lost, just raise your hand. But so what I really liked about where we are now and using binary codes is that I think that maybe to a certain extent, I don't think it's decolonization that is actually the proper word. I think it's more like uninstitutionalizing ourselves, coming forth more as individuals coming from a certain tribe, let's say Cree or Métis or wherever you come from, indigenous, non-indigenous. I think that we need to start talking more towards like how we feel spiritually, how we do accept things and not accept things. Because how do you decolonize this place? How do you make it so that everybody can just get along? Because right off the get-go, if we're going to talk about the future and put it in more of a positive context, we're actually right off the get-go, right out of the gate, making distinctions. It's very ethnographic, right? It's very like race-oriented. So I find that these black and the white, right? Everybody understands that. And now more so with binary codes. Binary codes is everywhere, like in your phones, everything. You need binary codes, zeros and ones, wampum belts, black and purple. White and purple. So I think that we were always in the future. Maybe we got institutionalized or colonized, or however you want to say it. And I find that if we're going to put it in the context of the future, or as of now moving forward, it's more so of graphically having responsibility to how we actually see the future. So in my practice, what I try to do is really not use dream catchers, feathers, and powwow, and all these kinds of things, and an eagle or a guy with a peace pipe. So I try to see things where it will go. So I'm very oriented towards a notion of where we were, where we are, and where we're going. And I find that if we go back to where we were, we're actually having a better opportunity to go where we want to go, which would be where we could have communication again, where we could have, where we could not have any more distinction. And through graphics, where I stand on this is that I try to, because I don't know a lot of other graphic designers. I just met one today. So like this is Indigenous, and I think there's a few around in Canada, but I don't know very many. So I don't have the capacity of having like long-winded conversations about type or what we're doing now. So what I find is that we like the responsibility that we need to uphold, us as individuals here in the community, is yes, we have to, like, it's okay to be traditional, have all these notions, go to powwow, sweat lodge, shake tents, all these things. But when we put it into a context of now and here, and like, it's really hard, because when we look at it really, and when we want to see it more so where we're not pointing the finger at anybody, where we're more like trying to communicate and connect with people, what I find is very interesting is that we, like, for me, for my work, what I do is that I use shapes and forms that are representative of, like, I try as much as possible to acknowledge and recognize all the nations within Canada, but interpreting them more in a contemporary way, or a more abstract way, not so literal, not feathers and leathers and teepees and igloos and stuff like that, because that's not the way we live anymore. Tourism Canada makes money off of that stuff, so it's not, I don't find it to be reality anymore. Because that's also the other thing about decolonization, which I find very interesting. Sorry if I'm talking about this, but I've been reading a lot about it. And what I find is that we are part of the present that is now, if we like it or not. We can try and change it, we can try and move it, we can try and forcefully make changes, but I think that we're at a place right now where we've learned enough from the colonizers, and then we've learned enough from us as an art form to actually have a stable conversation. No more necessarily of us and them, to a certain extent. And what is formidable about our actual community is that we like to share. We like to share knowledge, share different things. I think that we're at that position now, and graphically, that's what we're doing. If you look at art, if you look at graphics, or if you look at art, we go from, like, let's say Daphne Ojig to what is being doing now, and less literal things. People just draw little circles, and it's no more of interpretation. It's open to interpretation, but what I find that, like, graphically, what is very recognizable within all the communities would be, like, stars, would be water, would be earth, things that are round, nothing that is sharp, very, like, woman oriented, like, in regards to, like, their presence, their strong spirit, their power. And speaking of women, if you look at the Indigenous art scene, filmmaker scene, and art scene, women are really kicking ass, and I just have to mention that. It's formidable, it's scary, it feels good for me, but yeah, so these notions of maybe, like, thinking of, let's just say, thinking of things that have been forced on us in a way, like, I don't know, we can go into the sad stuff, like the, residential schools, all these things. I think that part of pain, and that part of feeling, like, the guilt, and it transcends, like, it goes from generation to generation now, right? So I think we're at a good spot right now where, reconciliation is happening, however you want to perceive it. But I think that we're at a place as a nation now so that we can actually open up a conversation. I think that we're at a place where our future is where we've always stood, necessarily. And I think that's what's great about the Indigenous art community and how we see our future, is that we always represented it by our past. We're not necessarily literal about it, but it's always part of us. Maybe at some point, generationally, what will happen is that there will be no more of Indigenous artist or artist that's Indigenous. It might be just an artist. So me, as a graphic designer that's Indigenous, that's Cree, and my dad's Métis, so I don't know where to go, so whatever side. This notion of separation is also kind of, I think, this is just me as a future. Maybe it's too political, but I find that if we do move forward in a more positive light, things are bound to happen. So yet again, I'm going to go back to the wampum belt that I find is probably the most magical visual thing in the world. Take away like, let's just forget everything that's been said about it and just look at it just in a very, very basic way. Graphically, it says a lot, right? It talks about like the good and the bad. It talks about the future with the binary codes, and maybe with what happened, and I don't know if I'm going too far here, but maybe what happened is that we've institutionalized everything that is actually an object. But in other words, the wampum belts, what's interesting about them is that they're actually maybe a microchip to a certain extent. I'm sorry if I'm going too far, but actually a microchip that certain people know how to read, that has the CPU, that has the computer, to actually understand a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of spirituality that's happened, right? And I think that the artists that we have in the like everybody that's an artist, creatively, speakers, politicians, everybody in the Indigenous community that bring change, I think that these are the tools that we had back in the day. It was so simple, so simple to use and to see, and for everybody to understand, from children to elders. I think that we might have lost that through time. So I think more so we're going towards visually something that's for sure will always have power, will always have our spirituality. But I think that with the wampum belt, in a way, I'm not saying like it's an object that you should put in a museum, but I think it's like an art piece or maybe a mistake. But I find it to be like kind of like a microchip. I find it to be like something that actually talks about the future. That was the first futuristic thing that anybody actually made. And it would be very interesting, and this, I'm just going to say this, and this may sound super off because it talks about UFOs, but what's interesting is that there's all these satellites across the world that were doing tests, right? And if we're going to talk about futurism, we could talk about X-Files and stuff, but anyway, the Marlboro Man, but what we're going to do is that what I find interesting about the UFOs and these satellites, they were trying to look for intelligent life form outside of Earth. So what happened is that they got a signal one day, and they had to encode it. And simply enough, this code was zeros and ones that we all know. Seems to me like even extraterrestrials use zeros and ones, from what I understand. But what's interesting about this is that the drawings and the men and like the kind of the seven on the wampum belts are exactly the same that these white people uncoded from the signal from outer space. Is it chance? Is it our future? Some people say that UFOs are actually our future and they come back to their past so that we don't screw up too much, so that we can survive. There's all these different notions. So I'm wondering if we're actually, like, as we're using binary codes to show like my name on this wall here, which are actually zeros and ones making an image, right? It's the computer that's smarter than us? Is it that we need to reformat our brains to a different kind of playing field? And I'm not talking, I don't wear any crystals or anything, and I'm not like, you know. But so that's where I stand. I think that we're at a point where we need to ask these questions. I don't think there's any kind of answer. Graphically, me as a graphic designer, I just try to push everything in a way that's understood by everybody, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And I also do art, and the art that I try and do is more so towards something where it's more inclusive of everybody, more so than trying to talk about my culture or your culture or their culture or stuff like that. I just want to do art, make it pretty, and get it done, and let curators talk about it, right? So that's where I'm at now with the residency that I'm doing. I'm also doing a Cree-syllabic font, a monospace font that I actually would like for like computer geeks or whatever you want to call them that code different types of things with this monospace font, and wonder what it would do in Cree-syllabic form. I'm also finishing that. So yeah, I think that, yet again, talking about graphics and talking about the future, I think that there's not a real good answer. And sorry if it was somewhat informal, but I'm sure there might be a few questions after my little presentation here. But thank you for inviting me, and good luck.
heard the font on her presentation might be weird, so we'll see what happens. I don't know.
Should we skip to the first?
Yeah. Is it going? Is this the slide clicker thing? Can I press it? Will it do anything? Oh, okay. Sweet.
So, Tansini Buju, Augi Mamegisi Indigenous guys. My given name by my auntie is Leading Eagle, and I'm from the Bear Clan. And my English name is Kevin Settee. And I didn't forget. I just thinking of whether or not I should tell a story, but I won't. Sorry. Yeah, me and Justin are co-founders of Red Rising magazine, and I just want to say miigwech to Julie and the organizers for creating this space here at the Winnipeg Art Gallery for people to come together and share and talk about our futures and what we want our futures to look like. And for my part, I'm going to just introduce myself, and then Justin's going to go into his graphic work and the design that he does, and then we're going to talk a little bit about Red Rising magazine. But for myself, I grew up in the West End my whole life pretty much. If anybody knows where Chicken Delight is on Home and Ellis, that's where I grew up. I went to Greenway, and I graduated from Gordon Bell High School. And I'm currently studying at the University of Winnipeg. I'm studying urban and inner city studies and geography. And I'm not much of an artist or a graphic designer, but growing up in Winnipeg in the inner city, I learned a lot from going to vigils and going to community events and stuff like that, like Meet Me at the Bell Tower. And I learned a lot through a lot of people in our communities, and it's only recently that we got together as a collective to start working on Red Rising magazine, and part of Red Rising magazine and what we do is this whole notion or idea of storytelling, and listening to people here talk, and coming to the art gallery and being having one of our launches here and going to Insurgence and Resurgence. I feel like a lot of everything that we do has to do with a story or storytelling. And so Red Rising magazine is a part of that, and Red Rising magazine within itself is its own story. I come from a community organizing background, and my contribution to Red Rising magazine is helping with events, connecting with people to do different events in different cities and stuff like that. And only recently have I started trying to do graphic design and graphic work in the past 2 issues. I just want to pass it off to Justin.
Thank you. Also, Kevin is working for the geography department at U of W, and he's working with Ian Morrow, and he's done a lot of really cool documentary kind of projects now. He's learning videography work, which is pretty amazing. A little bit about me. There's no picture of Kevin on here, but there's a picture of me. My name's Justin Larrabee. I grew up just outside of Winnipeg by Lorette. My mom's side is from Peguis. We're Cree and Scottish. And my dad's side is from St. Anne, Manitoba, and we're Métis. I was really lucky to have parents who worked in media. Basically, they owned a print shop, and they did like offset printing. So back when a print shop wasn't just like a laser printer, you had to have like a huge factory basically of offset presses and letter presses and stuff. So I got to grow up in a pretty cool environment, learning how to like make my own plates and stuff. I remember one time I got to print like a whole bunch of my own drawings the offset printer, which was pretty amazing. So I've always kind of had that, you know, that background. Whenever I hear like offset presses too, I feel like soothed inside. I'm just, oh, it feels so nice. I recently went to RB Russell, and we did like pretty much the same presentation there for the graphic design class. And they had an offset printer there, and the whole time I was just like, felt so good. I don't know, it was weird. Yeah, so a little bit about my background. I, you know, have always been interested in the arts and design, and I'm self-taught, and I just did a lot of stuff on my own. But it wasn't until I came to a place called Martha Street Studio. It's a printmaking studio here in Winnipeg. It's a community-based organization, so they're not for profit, and they offer free youth programming, and I really believe that it changed my life. You know, having access to that. So I learned how to do screen printing, etching, and I just kind of volunteered there all the time. And there was an opportunity that came up to do a summer internship with them. And Dylan Miner was there. So Dylan Miners, he's a Métis artist from Michigan. And he really inspired me, you know, he really inspired my art practice and made me look at like the community as a way of actually, you know, building my practice. And a lot of stuff that he does, he did a project called Native Kids Ride Bikes. So he goes to communities and he builds lowrider bikes, but the bikes are like decked out with the art of the communities that he's working in. And you know, I used to have a lowrider bike when I was a kid, and like my dad and I built it. So I felt like there's some like spiritual bond between us for lowriders or something. I don't know. But seriously, I think about this guy almost every day now, and it's really weird. But his art practice is what I want to do, and it really like kind of was like, okay, this is like, you know, something that I can do with my design. So at the same time as this, I was going to university, and I landed in the Urban and Inner City Studies program, and I met, you know, Kevin and Settee and basically all the members of the collective. And the whole idea of that program is like learning activism. It's like an activism class. That's what it is, right? Yeah, pretty much. And like learning how to like build not-for-profit organizations and stuff. And so I kind of learned about all the steps, and I worked with Martha Street, and I wrote this program in one of my classes called DIY for Change, which was a program to teach youth in the North End skills in printmaking and graphic design, but to use for activism. So I met Michael Champagne at this time and saw all the stuff that AYO was doing, and I was really, really inspired. And so a bunch of people from AYO came out and they participated in that. So we did like a few pop-up shop things, and it was pretty cool. So, and then beyond that, I've done some corporate stuff too. Like I worked for Farmery Estate Brewery, made some beer. Yeah, always had weird dream. I had this one weird dream about Farmery where like I ride my bike a lot, and like I had this dream where I made this really awesome beer poster, and then I was like biking along, and then someone picked up a pack of beer and then drunk drove and hit me. And that was my dream, and it was like a sign like, oh no, I need to get out of the beer industry because don't like beer. So I left that, and then I started working for the National Association of Indigenous Workers. And there I kind of learned some UI development and some coding stuff. And it really made me realize like there's a huge potential in design for youth in the inner city. So not just for activism, which is incredibly important, but there's actually like working for that organization. After that, I kept being asked to do jobs by First Nations communities and up and coming First Nations organizations. And I just got overwhelmed and swamped. Like I had too many jobs. I'm like, I don't know what to do with them. And, you know, I also didn't know any other Indigenous designers. Like, I really don't know anyone. Like, I think you're like, you know what I mean? Yeah, we could start a, but that's actually what I want to do. Like, I actually want to start a club. But so I've been thinking about something like a national Indigenous designers collective, you know, where we share jobs among each other. Because I have the feeling that we're all swamped with jobs and we have too many. So we can kind of share that load. So that kind of, oh, hold on, I still have some more stuff before we get into that. So that kind of spawned me doing a lot of research and thinking about like, okay, so why is there no Indigenous designers? Like, clearly there's an issue. You know, I spent a lot of time doing workshops in the inner city, and just seeing the resources dedicated to tech, it's really embarrassing. And like, you know, working at different drop-in centers and stuff and community organizations and seeing, you know, broken computer labs, or like seeing a computer lab that used to be a computer lab, but then it turned into a room full of broken computers and like one that works, or just like, you know, not having enough, like not paying for enough, you know, data on the plan and stuff. So you'll have a whole computer lab of computers, but none of them work. Like, the internet won't work if everyone's using them, because there's just not enough data. So I started seeing this. I'm thinking, okay, I really, really want to fix this in the inner city. And so I started doing some research, and so like the federal government has like made a big report. It's called the Information and Communication. Oh no, it's done by the Information and Communications Technology Council, and it's called Canada's National Strategy to Develop Canada's Talent in a Global Digital Economy. And what that does is, the overarching thing is, it states that the growth in digital jobs has outpaced the overall economy in the last 2 years by over 4-to-1, leading to a huge demand of 182,000 skilled ITC, so tech workers, by 2019, with an additional 36,000 workers by 2020. And basically this report's arguing that we're having like a labor shortage in tech stuff. And so me personally, like doing Indigenous design, I'm like witnessing this, because I'm like, where's all the designers? Like, where's my buddies? Like, I need some minions to come help me out. But they're like not around. And like the report itself talks about like high talent pools, like, you know, women and newcomers, but a big piece of it is like investment in Indigenous tech programming, you know, and just kind of like the statistics you always hear, that we're like the biggest growing population in Canada, and out of anyone going into any Indigenous people going into post-secondary right now, only about 2.5 to 3% are actually going into tech-related fields. So that's where, like, I was really, really excited about this conference, like, so much, because I think, you know, I'm having this realization, oh my God, like, we're moving into this, like, you know, information age, and we might be falling behind, you know, but I'm having this kind of thought, like, well, you know what, and then seeing this conference, it's like, well, maybe we're not. Maybe we're just like, we're here, we're around, but we just need to be kind of like brought together. And so it's pretty exciting. So yeah, so for me, I've been wanting to kind of like work on that, you know, kind of pushing that the resources and access to tech education for inner city youth. That's been a really big thing, and I think a piece of that for me is Red Rising as well. So when we first started Red Rising, like, I really saw it as an opportunity to kind of like use my skills in design to actually do work for the community. But as we grew, it's really becoming an opportunity for like training for youth. So like at our last launch, we kind of did a mentorship model where we had, was it Settee, Settee and Jen, who were mentoring youth on photography there. I had a screen printing set up there, so we had a number of youth like running the screen printing area, which is pretty cool because I just got to like step back, be like, here you go. So I think, a lot of this stuff that I've been thinking about in terms of, this kind of future and getting people educated really fits into, my reason for being in Red Rising magazine. But beyond that, maybe I'll let Kevin start to talk more about Red Rising. So, hold on. Oh.
So if you look up on the screen, you'll see some headlines. Highest homicide rates in Canada, machete attacks, Tina Fontaine found in the river, police lay murder charges for death found in dumpster. And these are all mainstream media headlines about who we are as Indigenous people. And with Red Rising magazine, one of the things that we know and we understand is that this is a part of our reality. These things actually happen in our communities and we're a part of this. But at the same time, we also have a lot of amazing stories and amazing people doing amazing work. Like, look at everyone here at this conference that's doing amazing work. Justin just talked about, his vision, his dream. And so for us, we experience these things, we see these things, this is a part of our reality. But the other part of our reality is all this other stuff, Meet me at the Bell Tower, Michael Champagne and Jenna Wirch and Chris Classio and Marcus Head and all these people doing amazing work over there. Every single Friday they're creating amazing stories and they're creating a space for people to come and do amazing work. You have God Bannock, Althea Gibosh, you have Work Like Drag the Red, you have Bear Clan Patrol that's out 5 days a week, and they have a Mama Bear Clan Patrol now in Central. There's 13 Fires last year that organized 13 events who are doing amazing work and community activism, and you have Idle No More, that sparked a lot of these younger generations of artists and thinkers and activists and stuff like that. So this is also a part of our reality, and for Red Rising magazine, these are our stories, and these are the stories that we want to share and that we want to put out into our communities and into Canada. This is important for young people to see these positive things that are happening. And so at our first meeting, we talked about, that other slide that we talked about in the first slide there. Everyone went around the table and talked about how mass media shifted their story to fit their narrative and what they wanted. And I had a story about CBC that I won't share right now. But they really, they got me good. They said they wanted to do a story about this, but then at the end it was a story about something else, and I almost lost my job, and I was just like, what the hell is going on here? And so everybody shared those kind of stories, and we said, let's do a magazine. It was actually Justin and Lenard. It was at a Water Wednesdays just down the street here, actually just right here, like 2-minute walk. There's a Water Wednesdays, and we sat down at Stella's just over here, and we talked. And Lenard had a piece of paper, and we said we're going to create a magazine. And we wrote down a bunch of topics, ceremonies, poetry, university, whatever, everything. So many different kinds of topics. And then we wrote down a big list of names of people who we wanted to reach out to. And a lot of these people were people who were writing bomb Facebook statuses, and sharing their ideas. And so we made a list, and Justin whipped up a submission call out. So he created a graphic, and just by that one graphic, I don't know how many submissions we got, but we got quite a bit of submissions.
It was originally going to be called Tribe City.
Yeah. Lenard wanted it to be called Tribe City, and everyone was like, what the hell? Red Rising, man, that's what we agreed on. And so there was a Tribe City call out, and we were like, what the hell, Tribe City? And we switched it back, so it would actually be funny to see where it would have been if we were Tribe City. I don't know. Anyways, we started doing issues, and so our first issue was the Rising Generation, and for most of the collective, it was our, I guess you can say, initiation into the magazine world. Most of us wrote in that first magazine. I don't know if you want to talk about the artwork a little bit, like the front cover and stuff like that, and how you...
Sure. Yeah, the first issue, so we forgot to ask for like art callouts for the first issue. So I just like found all the art that was on my computer that I created that I never released, and I just put it in it. So if you want to see my portfolio, then get issue 1, because. But yeah, so I chose the person on the cover. It's untitled, and I don't know, just because I think it's something different that I think this was really important. Her image was really important. It kind of represents like the matriarchal, but mixed with like kind of like a bicultural spirit. This kind of she evolved into like actually a series that I did that I call my creature series, where they're like a liminal spirits. So it's spirits stuck in between two worlds and they can't quite figure out what's going on. We only have a minute. So anyways, that's what she is. So yeah, the rest of them were all community submissions though.
So we're gonna try to whip through the last couple slides. So the first one was like a lot of hope, a lot of great stories. The second issue was like a lot of, when we got the submissions, it was just a lot of hard stories, truth. And so we call that regenerating the spirit. Every issue we have a featured writer. So at the top you can see Pam Palmeter, Christy Belcourt. We did an issue as Storytelling as Resistance. There's a piece that was written by Erica Violi called Land, Language, and Decolonial Love. And it actually inspired our 5th issue, which was the Love issue. Catherine Vermette was our featured writer. And then we did a Revolt issue for Canada 150. And and so after the Revolt issue, we did the Two-Spirit issue, which isn't on there, but And we just released a, pardon me? We have some copies at the front if people want to check them out. So the Two-Spirit issue is actually really amazing because we partnered with Julie and Jamie, and we did the launch here upstairs, and it was just like really, it was like a dream kind of. So it was pretty cool. We do our launches. We try to keep them in the community. We try to make them as accessible as possible. We try to, it's free. We try to make it so that people can come in for free. We host community events that are just outside of our magazine launches as well. So you see like Andrea Landry, we did one Indigenizing Media with The Uniter. The Uniter's a student magazine out of the University of Winnipeg and the Students Association. We do a comedy night. We're also going to be doing another comedy night, February 13th, so put that in your calendars if you're from Winnipeg, at the West End Cultural Center. Pictures from our launches. The Love issue. Oh, actually, this is the Two-Spirit issue here. This is upstairs. Try and mentor young people at our launches as well to learn how to do different things. Toronto launch. How can you get involved? Submit to Red Rising Magazine. Get your youth to write. Our next issue is the language issue, and we want people to submit in our languages. And we got you.
Very inspiring initiative, and it's great to see so much enthusiasm. We've all witnessed the creation of the first Indigenous Designers Club today, so congratulations.
$1 a member.
We have a few minutes to take a few questions. So the 2 mics on both sides, there's one on both sides. I invite questions on coding, on new initiatives, on the future of coding.
Hi,
Hi.
Sebastian.
Yeah.
Can you please make a wampum font?
Can I please name what?
Make a wampum font.
That's interesting. We need to discuss as a designers club. I think that's a good. I've done fonts that are actually look like squares and triangles.
Yeah, no, I know. I need a wampum font, please.
I'm gonna make you a wampum font, Maddie. There you go.
All right.
Tansei bonjour. My name's Nathan Legacy. I am a master's student at the University of Manitoba, looking at Indigenous video games stuff. So I get to play video games as studying. I'm going to mess up your name. I apologize. Dr. Rilla Khaled. Is that
Yep, Khaled.
Khaled?
Yep.
I really enjoyed your presentation. So when you talk about reskinning and visualization in video games, one thing I noticed that you look at a lot of just reskinning and the actual what we see in video games, and so what's special, what I think is special, maybe not for everyone, what I find beautiful in video games is it's not just what the player sees, it's what the player experiences through sounds, through interactions with, like, for example, Nuna and the fox and Never Alone, the relationship that the player has with both characters, the relationship that the player has with the environments. So I was just kind of wondering, when you're talking about the future of representations in video games, do you have any thoughts on or comments on representations of just more than what the player is actually seeing in a character? Because you mentioned a lot of, like, it was fascinating watching you talk about all the different men skins up on the screen. I was like, oh, I know this character and that character and this. So it's kind of interesting. I would like to hear your comments on more than just what the player sees as visualization.
Sure. So I 100% agree that what is special about games is not just what they look like, but how they feel and how they make us feel. You know, like interactivity is about a conversation. The player does something and the game responds to us. So we are talking to something, and we are talking to other people through the systems that they have coded for us. So when I talk about representation being code deep, like what I would really love to see is for everyone to not just look at existing game genres. So to say, okay, here's a platformer, or here is a first-person shooter, or here is an adventure game. I want people to look at the behaviors that those games already convey, already represent, and think about, is this a behavior that is true to the experience that I want to evoke in my players, or is this true to my world experience? So like a lot of my work in the past was thinking about cultural values that are present in games. And together with my husband, Pippin Barr, we did this study where we sat down with the work of this amazing cross-cultural theorist by the name of Shalom Schwartz. And while it's probably very antithetical for anyone in the humanities, Schwartz came up with this, from a psychology perspective, he did this massive study of people's values around the world. And what he was able to show is if you are a country that really privileges autonomy, then you can't simultaneously be a place that really, really privileges being together. Okay, there are some of these values that are just intrinsically in tension with one another. So we looked at video games and said, what are the values that you know, that certain video games kind of promote. And if you look at first-person shooters, a lot of the time it is about mastery, it's about achievement, it's about domination. And if that's the story you want to tell, absolutely fine, we can continue replicating that. But if that is not the story that we want to tell, then we have to start thinking about, well, what is a new game mechanic that we need to come up with that lets us enact the realities that we want to see in game worlds? And that happens at the code level. Like, we need to recode what those mechanics are. We need to come up with new mechanics.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, Rilla, I also want to ask about your call for more diverse programmers. So just speaking about the intersection between games and culture, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the subculture of gamers and programmers themselves, not so much just the video games that are a medium for culture, but the subculture of the people making those games and how that culture can replicate the dominant culture as well and work against increasing representation of other cultures.
All right, excellent question, and always like excellent question, and simultaneously something that makes me a little bit sad to talk about, because in terms of representation amongst game makers, it is not a diverse community, right? And this is something we've known for a long time, that if we want more diversity in our games, we need to have more diverse makers making games. However, it's not, like, the picture is not completely bleak. Like, one thing that I'm extremely excited about is, for whatever reason, if you look at the experimental game scene, diverse makers are overrepresented there. Like, in terms of the population, like, there's a lot of perspectives being sort of foregrounded there that are, like, if you were trying to make a picture of the world based just on what you see in experimental games, then the face of the world would look very different. So, you know, a maker like Elizabeth Laponce, she's important. She's pushing experimental games forward, and she is conveying particular perspectives. Another quite interesting pocket of developers for me, and I'm really not sure why this happened, but there are a lot of trans makers, like a lot of transgender game makers who are doing a lot of work within the experimental game scene. And I think, like, my sort of theory based on very little is that it was to do with this kind of melting pot, the San Francisco melting pot of tech culture and the, you know, the strong LGBTQ community there. So they, particularly with a medium like Twine, there are so many trans people represented in Twine. Like, that medium, I would say, is almost, you know, one that is theirs, right? Like, maybe I shouldn't have put it quite that strongly, but there are pockets of game dev culture where there is a lot of diversity, and experimental games are slowly but surely changing the way, changing the cultures of game making. It's still not the case that we're seeing as much diversity within the AAA industry as we might like, and these AAA games really are the ones that most of the world knows about. On the other hand, there are small waves of influence from experimental makers back to AAA. So there's definitely hope, but we need more diverse people making games.
One last question.
Hi. I was thinking as you were speaking, particularly the Red Rising folks, about, like, how do we code community? Like, how do we code, like, the radical relationalities that Red Rising has created from obviously their original vision into how it's being activated in all these different citified Indigenous territories. And I was thinking about how you were saying that, comedy night, mentorships, all of these are sort of infused in your practice of Red Rising, and how we're sort of accountable to each other in these spaces. So I just wanted to offer sort of like a sense of bringing these forms together as the necessity to recode, but it's already being recoded amongst Indigenous bodies through the work that you're doing. So if there was a way to kind of code these radical forms of relationship building, vigils, the types of activities that happen in communities in ways that I don't know the languages for it yet, but I really think that your practice with Red Rising is really shifting our practices in terms of how we think about the shapes of our communities and how these shapes and forms can be thought about in terms of embodied choreographic coding practices. So I loved your presentation, and I just want to commend you for the work that you're doing and say thank you for it.
Thank you.
I was just gonna say, like, with say miigwech for, is that Karen? Karen Recollet? Yeah, Karen actually was on a panel at our launch in Toronto, and was able to share some amazing ideas. But yeah, like with the comedy night, like what I said before about storytelling, comedy is a form of storytelling that's so important, because they use one of the healing practices of our people, which is humor. And especially within our communities, when there's a lot of bad stuff going on, you need these people to tell these funny stories, or to turn them upside down and make them funny. And because it gets rough sometimes. But miigwech for sharing that, and I think Justin wants to share.
Yeah,
you said something I think that is important. It's been with me since this morning. And you said I don't have the language for that. And that's something I've been mulling over during all the presentations to this, the question of terminology of the future. Mm-hmm. Going back to you, Julie, this morning, like stepping away from the binaries, and then Wanda talking about the necessity of redefining the frames, and you talked about that as well, and redefining design. So terminology not being just language, but visuals as well. And what is the terminology of the future? I think that we're often stumbling on those words of, you were mentioning deinstitutionalization instead of decolonization, and we still use indigenization, and we're kind of using all these words, and they're turning into mush, it seems to me. They're ill-defined often. So I'm just leaving, and maybe that's a question that will be picked up tomorrow sometime, but this whole question of the future of the words and the forms that we're using, future of terminology, to talk to each other and to talk about what we're really talking about, and not having it defined by somebody else. Right? So thank you very much for brilliant presentations. Thank you for your attention. Great audience.